This is my true story. I worked my whole life so my son could live in comfort. I gave him everything: food, shelter, cars, even bailed him out when he failed. I thought when I grew old, he would hold my hand with love. But one night, after an argument, he dragged me into the garage, threw me into the trunk of his car, and slammed it shut as if I was nothing but luggage. My heart broke, but I was not powerless. You won't believe what I did next. Before that, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe. I was not born into comfort. My life was shaped by hard hands, broken shoes, and long days that started before sunrise and ended long after the sun had disappeared. From the moment I could carry a hammer, I worked. From the moment I could hold a shovel, I dug. Every coin I earned was not spent on myself. I saved, I sacrificed, and I dreamed. Not dreams for me, dreams for my son. I told myself that even if my body broke, even if my back bent like an old tree, my son would walk straight. He would never taste hunger. He would never sleep in cold rooms like I once did. That was my promise. That was my sacrifice. I built everything with my hands. The house, the land, the small business I grew from nothing, all of it came from blood and sweat. When others rested, I worked. When others bought new things for themselves, I repaired the old things I already had. My clothes had patches. My shoes had holes. But my son, he had new uniforms for school. He had polished shoes that shined in the morning light. When he was little, I carried him on my shoulders so his feet would never touch the mud. When he grew older, I carried the weight of his future on my back. I told myself, this is what a father does. I bought him his first car when he was only 20. Not because I had extra money. I didn't. I sold a piece of my land to make it happen. People told me I was foolish, that I should keep it for myself. But I shook my head and said, a father must give. When he fell into debt, I was there. I stood in line at the bank, sweating, trembling, and I paid every penny. When the law came close because of his reckless mistakes, I stood in front like a shield. I begged, I bargained, I paid again. I thought to myself, maybe this time he will see my love. Maybe this time he will turn his life around. But the truth was, every time I saved him, I lost a piece of myself. Every time I bailed him out, he learned not gratitude, but arrogance. He believed that no matter what he did, I would clean his mess. He thought the sacrifices of a father were endless, and I let him believe it. I thought patience was love. I thought silence was wisdom. But silence only fed his pride. I remember one winter when the cold crept into my bones and my hands shook so badly I could hardly eat. That same week, I gave him money to take his wife on vacation. I told him I was fine, that I didn't need much. But inside, I felt the sting. My coat was thin, but I smiled and told him to buy her something nice. I thought he would remember. I thought he would look at me one day and say, "Father, you gave me everything. Let me give back." I dreamed of growing old with dignity. I dreamed that one day he would push me in a wheelchair down the same streets I once carried him on. I dreamed that he would sit beside me in the evenings, hand on my shoulder, telling me I had done enough. That was the picture I held in my heart through all the long years of work and pain. That was the story I told myself when my body ached and my hands bled. But my dreams were lies. The truth is, my sacrifices became invisible. He never saw the weight I carried. He only saw what he thought was his right. The house? He thought it was already his. The land? His as well. The money? He believed it flowed because of him, not me. He grew not into a man of respect, but into a man of entitlement. And I, the father who gave everything, became to him nothing but an old shadow in the corner of his grand life. Still, in my heart, I held hope. Even as I watched him speak with arrogance, even as I heard the sharpness of his words, I told myself, a father must wait. Maybe kindness will return. Maybe gratitude will bloom late. I told myself this until the night he showed me the truth. The night he locked me in the trunk and treated me not as a man, not as a father, but as luggage. That was the price of my sacrifice. That was the reward for decades of love. Cruelty does not arrive with thunder. It starts small, like a drip of water on stone. At first, I did not see it for what it was. I told myself he was stressed, tired, angry at the world. But over time, I realized he was not angry at the world. He was angry at me. The first signs came in words, simple words, sharp words. "Old man," he said once when I moved too slowly to bring him tea. The words stung, but I swallowed them. Another time, when my hands trembled and I spilled a little water on the table, he snapped, "Can't you hold anything steady?" His wife laughed. I felt my cheeks burn, but I stayed silent. I told myself, he does not mean it. But the words grew heavier. He began calling me baggage. Not father, not dad, baggage. "You're nothing but old baggage I have to carry," he muttered one evening when I asked for help with the heater. I froze. I wanted to remind him of the years I carried him on my shoulders, the nights I stayed awake when he was sick, the mornings I worked hungry so he could eat. But my lips did not move. My silence was my shield, but it became his weapon. At the dinner table, the cruelty became entertainment. When my fork shook in my hand, he would smirk and whisper to his wife, loud enough for me to hear, "Look, he can't even eat like a human anymore." She laughed, sipping her drink, her eyes watching me like I was a joke. My heart sank each time, but I forced a smile. I wanted peace. I wanted family. I thought if I ignored it, it would stop. Instead, it grew. Doors began to slam in my face. When I walked too slowly into the living room, he would close the door and leave me outside. When I tried to speak during conversations, he rolled his eyes and said, "Why do you always talk nonsense?" His wife would chuckle, covering her mouth as if it was all a game. But to me, it was no game. Each word was a cut. Each laugh was a knife. There were days when I asked myself if I had imagined it. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was wrong. But then I remembered the tone of his voice, sharp like glass. I remembered the look in his eyes, cold and full of contempt. That was not my imagination. That was truth. The boy I once called my pride was now my tormentor. He began keeping distance from me in public. When neighbors greeted me, he would walk ahead, pretending he did not know me. When family visited, he spoke over me, silencing my words. Once, in front of cousins, he said, "The old man just takes up space. He doesn't know anything anymore." They laughed awkwardly, unsure how to respond. I sat there, my head low, my chest tight. My silence protected me, but it also betrayed me. They thought I agreed with him. They thought I was nothing. The worst part was not the words. It was the enjoyment. He enjoyed my humiliation. He wanted me to feel small. He wanted his wife to see me crumble. She encouraged it with her laughter, her smiles at his insults, her smirks when I failed to defend myself. They were a pair, one striking, the other clapping. Together, they turned me into a target. I spent nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, asking myself where I went wrong. How did the son I carried in my arms turn into this? I remembered his first steps, his first words, his small hand holding mine when he was scared of the dark. I remembered his tears when he was a boy, and how I promised him I would never let him suffer. And now, as an old man, I was the one suffering. And he was the one delivering the pain. The signs of cruelty grew louder. He no longer hid it. He mocked me openly, like I was no longer a father, but a burden he wanted the world to see. He thought my silence meant weakness. He thought my patience meant surrender. He thought he had stripped me of all dignity. But what he did not know was this. Every insult, every laugh, every slammed door was building something inside me. A storm, a decision, a line I would one day cross. At that time, I still hoped. I still told myself he would change. I thought maybe one morning he would look at me and remember I was his father. But deep down, I knew the truth. The cruelty was no longer an accident. It was who he had become. And worse, it was only the beginning. The cruel act came like a storm after a long, dark sky. For years, I endured his words, his laughter at my weakness, his wife's smirks when he mocked me. I thought I had already felt the worst he could give me. But I was wrong. There was a night when his cruelty crossed a line no father should ever face. It began with a small argument, like so many before. I asked him why he always shouted, why he always treated me like I was nothing. I spoke calmly, hoping he might pause, maybe reflect. But instead, his face twisted with rage, his eyes turned cold, his jaw tightened, and I knew something inside him had snapped. He rose from his chair and came at me with heavy steps. His hand grabbed my collar with such force that my frail body could not resist. My feet barely touched the ground as he dragged me across the living room, my voice caught in my throat. I wanted to tell him to stop, to remind him I was his father, but no words came out. My body was too weak. My heart pounded against my ribs like a drum of fear. His wife stood at the side, watching with wide eyes. But there was no pity in her gaze, only curiosity, like she was watching a show. He pulled me into the garage, the cold air cutting through my thin shirt. I tried to hold on to something, the wall, the doorframe, but his strength was merciless. He yanked me forward like I was a sack of old clothes. My knees scraped against the floor, my arms shook. He didn't slow down. He opened the trunk of his car, the heavy lid rising like the mouth of a beast. Before I could breathe, he shoved me inside. My back hit the hard steel, my head thudded against the side. Pain shot through my ribs as the space closed around me. And then, the sound I will never forget. The trunk slamming shut. Darkness swallowed me whole. The echo of the metal lid rang in my ears like a coffin closing. The air was thin, the space small, my chest pressing against my knees. I tried to stretch, but there was no room. My hands shook as they pressed against the lid, but it did not move. The car smelled of oil, rubber, and dirt. I gasped for air, every breath thinner than the last. From outside, his voice cut through the silence, cold, sharp, and merciless. "This is where you belong," he spat, "hidden like trash." His wife laughed softly, a cruel echo that pierced the darkness around me. Then their footsteps faded, leaving me trapped in a cage of steel. In that moment, I felt more than fear. I felt betrayal deeper than any wound. I remembered carrying him to school in the rain, holding an umbrella over his small head while my own body got soaked. I remembered giving him my last piece of bread when I had nothing left to eat. And now, that same son had stuffed me into the trunk of his car, treating me like luggage, like waste. My heart ached heavier than my body. Every bump in the road rattled my bones as he drove. I could not see where we were going, only feel the motion, the jerks, the sharp turns. Each one slammed my shoulder or my knees against the hard walls. I pressed my hands against the steel, desperate, but the trunk did not budge. I shouted once, but my voice was swallowed by the engine. No one heard, no one came. I lay there in silence, my body trembling, my breath shallow. I asked myself again and again, how did it come to this? How did my own son, the boy I loved more than my own life, turn me into nothing but cargo? I thought of death. I thought maybe this was how my story would end. Not in a bed, not surrounded by love, but in the trunk of a car, forgotten, humiliated. But even in that moment of despair, something inside me began to change. The pain was real, the fear was sharp, but underneath it grew something stronger. Anger. Resolve. A fire I had not felt in years. If I lived through this, if I stepped out of that trunk alive, I would not stay silent again. I would not forgive again. This act, this cruel act, had broken something inside me. But it also built something new. A steel will. A decision. The son who locked me away like luggage would pay. The darkness inside that trunk was like a grave. I could not see my hands in front of me, only feel the cold steel pressing against my skin. The air was thick and hot, filled with the smell of oil, rubber, and old dust. Every breath felt smaller than the one before, as if the trunk itself wanted to swallow me whole. My knees pressed up into my chest, my ribs ached from the way he had thrown me in, and my head throbbed where it had struck the side. I lay curled up, trapped like a broken animal, and I could hear nothing but the rumble of the engine above me. The bumps in the road became whips across my body. Each time the car turned, my shoulder slammed into one wall, then the other. My bones rattled, my chest burned. I tried to stretch, but there was no space. My back pressed against the floor, my hands clawed at the lid, but it did not move. I hit it with my fists, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the car. No one could hear me. No one would come. My breath grew shallow. I gasped for air, my throat dry, my lungs aching. I closed my eyes, and memories flooded in. Not just of that night, but of my life. I remembered the boy he once was, the small child who cried in the middle of the night, and I carried him on my chest until he slept. I remembered the mornings I rose early to pack his school lunch, even when I had no lunch for myself. I remembered saving money, hiding coins in jars, so that he could have new shoes, new books, a better life. I remembered his smile as a child, wide and innocent, before cruelty had hardened it. Those memories were knives in that trunk. Each one cut deeper than the steel walls. I thought about death. I thought about how many old men die quietly, but never like this. To die in the trunk of a car, treated as luggage, tossed aside by the son I gave my life to. I whispered a prayer. Not for mercy, not for forgiveness, but for strength. If I lived through this, I told myself, I would not forget. I would not let this moment pass without an answer. The heat grew heavier, sweat dripped down my face, soaking into my shirt. My heart raced so fast, I thought it might break inside my chest. Every second stretched like an hour. Time inside that trunk was different. It was endless. A prison without bars, a coffin without dirt. I could hear faint sounds outside, the crunch of tires on gravel, the distant laugh of my son, the click of his wife's shoes. They were close, mocking, living freely, while I gasped like a dying man. I tried again to push. My frail arms pressed against the lid with all the strength left in me. My wrists shook, my hands slid against the hot metal. Nothing moved. The trunk stayed shut. The walls stayed silent. The only sound was my own breath, ragged and weak. My body trembled, but my mind stayed awake. In that silence, I thought of something else. Not just his cruelty, but his weakness. He thought this was power. He thought locking me here proved I was nothing. But he had forgotten something. Power is not in fists or steel. Power is in truth. And I still had that. The car finally stopped. My body jolted forward, my head hitting the side again. Pain shot through me like lightning. I heard footsteps. I froze, waiting for the lid to open. But nothing. Minutes passed, then hours. They left me there, alone, trapped in darkness. I curled tighter, my chest heaving, my body begged to give up. But my spirit whispered, not yet, not here. Inside that trunk, shame lived with me, fear lived with me. But something else grew too. Resolve, I told myself again and again. If I walk out of this alive, I will end this. He will not win. He will not bury me here. I was not luggage. I was not trash. I was his father, and I would rise. Time inside that trunk felt endless. My body was cramped, my breath short, and I thought maybe he would never open it again. Then, suddenly, I heard footsteps, heavy, slow, dragging on the garage floor. The air shifted, the light above me changed, and then, the lid opened. For a moment, the brightness stabbed my eyes. I blinked, squinting at the shape standing above me. It was my son, my own blood. His face was twisted into a smirk, his eyes cold. He did not look at me with pity. He did not look at me with guilt. He looked at me like I was nothing but an object he had placed there. The air rushed in, but instead of freedom, I felt shame. I tried to sit up, but before I could, he pressed the tip of his shoe against me. Not to help, not to comfort, to mock. He poked my side with his foot, tapping me like luggage being inspected at an airport. "Did you enjoy your ride, old man?" he sneered. His voice was sharp, full of poison, each word meant to stab. My lips trembled, but no words came out. I wanted to remind him of who I was. I wanted to shout that I was his father, not his toy. But the words stayed buried in my throat. Behind him stood his wife. Her arms crossed, her lips curled into a smile, her eyes locked on me like I was some pitiful show. She did not speak, but her silence was worse. Her silence was approval. Her silence was enjoyment. She tilted her head slightly, as if watching a dog crawl. The smirk on her face told me everything. She found joy in my humiliation. Together, they made me smaller than I had ever felt in my life. I tried to shift my body, to climb out, but he pushed me back down with his shoe. "Stay there," he barked, his voice loud, echoing in the garage. "You look better like this. Hidden, weak, helpless." His wife laughed softly, a cruel sound that burned into my ears. It was not the laughter of someone surprised, it was the laughter of someone entertained. I was not a father to them. I was not family. I was their entertainment. Then, as if my pain was not enough, he leaned closer. His breath smelled of wine, his voice low and venomous. "You should be grateful I even opened it," he said. "Dogs don't deserve tables. Trash doesn't deserve respect. This is your place now." His words cut deeper than knives. They pierced into my chest, deeper than the bruises on my ribs. And before I could move, before I could breathe, he slammed the trunk shut again. The sound echoed through me like thunder, sealing me once more in darkness. I heard them laugh outside, their footsteps walking away. The garage door creaked, then silence returned. I was trapped again. Trapped not just in steel, but in shame. In that moment, lying in the dark after his mockery, I realized something. My son no longer saw me as his father. He no longer remembered the man who carried him, fed him, protected him. To him, I was less than human. I was a joke. I was an old man he could shove into a trunk and laugh about. That realization cut me deeper than the bruises on my body. My love for him, the love that kept me patient for years, shattered into pieces. But the mockery also gave me something else. Fire. Rage, resolve. When that lid closed again, I knew something had changed forever. He thought his laughter had broken me. He thought his shoe pressing me down had erased my dignity. But instead, it lit a spark inside me that he could not see. In that darkness, I made a promise. A promise that I would never forgive this. A promise that I would rise, and when I rose, I would take everything from him. Lying in that trunk after the second slam, I felt something inside me change. Shame had been my companion for years. I had endured insults, endured laughter, endured silence. But that night, when the lid closed again and their laughter echoed in my ears, shame turned into something sharper. It turned into steel. My humiliation boiled into rage. The trunk that was meant to bury me became the fire that forged me. I was no longer just an old man being mocked. I was a father who had reached the boiling point. I thought about every sacrifice I made for him, every coin I saved, every debt I paid, every time I stood between him and the law. I remembered the years when my hands bled so his hands could stay clean. And now, those same hands had shoved me into a trunk. The memories burned like fuel inside me. My heart pounded, not from fear now, but from fury. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. A son could raise his voice. A son could even argue. But a son who throws his father into a trunk like luggage? That son has killed the bond himself. In the dark, I clenched my fists. My bones were weak, but my will was strong. I told myself, this ends now. Not tomorrow. Not in some distant hope. Now. I would no longer stay quiet. I would no longer let him spit on my life's work. I would no longer allow him to treat me like garbage while I sat silent. If he thought I was powerless, he was blind. I still had one weapon stronger than fists or age. I had the truth, and I would use it. I thought about the papers locked in my drawer, the documents, the records, the receipts. Years of secrets he thought were buried. His unpaid loans, his fraud, his debts hidden under my name, his lies to his wife, his lies to the law, his lies to the world. I had kept them hidden, believing one day he would change. I had shielded him when the world wanted to expose him. But that night, I made a vow. No more. Those secrets would no longer be his shield. They would be my sword. I also thought about the law. The same police I once begged to spare him. The same officers I once paid to keep him free. I realized I had been protecting him from justice for too long. But justice was not his enemy. Justice was mine. Justice would now be my ally. He thought locking me in a trunk would silence me. Instead, it gave me the courage to finally speak. As I lay there, bruised and cramped, I no longer felt fear of death. I felt fear of silence. If I died without fighting back, his cruelty would live on, unchecked, unpunished. But if I lived and spoke, his arrogance would crumble, his pride would shatter, his laughter would turn into cries. I swore to myself, I will not die in this trunk. I will not end as his victim. I will rise as his reckoning. That night was my boiling point. It was the death of the father who stayed quiet, and the birth of the man who would bring his son to justice. My tears dried, my shame hardened, my spirit sharpened. The boy I raised had become a monster, but he had forgotten one truth: monsters can be defeated, even by the old and broken. And I would be the one to do it. When the trunk finally opened for the last time that night, and I was dragged out like nothing more than an old sack, my body ached from head to toe. My ribs hurt, my skin was scratched, and my pride was torn. But my spirit, for the first time in years, was alive. I staggered inside, my son laughing, his wife smirking, as if they had broken me completely. They thought the silence in my mouth meant surrender. They thought the slow steps of my body meant defeat. But deep in my chest, I carried a new fire. I knew exactly what I was going to do. The very next morning, while the house still slept, I put on my old coat, the one with torn cuffs, and walked out the door. My legs trembled, but they carried me forward with purpose. Every step across the street, every sound of my shoes scraping the pavement felt like a drumbeat of justice. For the first time in a long time, I was not walking as a victim. I was walking as a man who carried the truth. I went straight to the police station. My hands shook as I opened the door, not from fear but from anger that still burned in me. The officer at the desk looked up, surprised to see an old man walk in so early. I stood tall, even though my back was bent. "I want to file a report," I said. My voice cracked, but my eyes did not waver. He asked me what kind of report. I pulled up my shirt, showing the bruises on my ribs, the rope burns around my wrists, the scratches across my arms. Then I spoke the words I never thought I would say. My son locked me in the trunk of his car. The officer's face changed. He leaned forward, his eyes sharp, his pen ready. "Tell me everything," he said. And I did. I told him how I was dragged across the floor, shoved like trash, shut in darkness like an object. I told him about the laughter, the mockery, the shoe pressing me down. Every word I spoke was heavy, but with each one, I felt lighter. The silence I had carried for years was broken. They took photos of my bruises. They asked to see the car. I led them back to the house, my heart pounding as we entered the garage. I pointed to the trunk, still stained with the marks of where I had clawed at the inside. The officer opened it, leaned in, and nodded slowly. "He did this to you?" he asked. I looked him in the eye and said, "Yes. My own son." In that moment, I felt a strange mix of pain and power. Pain because I had spoken the truth aloud. Power because the truth was now no longer mine alone. It belonged to the law. It belonged to justice. For years, I had hidden his cruelty, covered his sins, protected his name. But now, I had handed him over to the one force he could not mock. They wrote the report, stamped it, and opened a case of elder abuse. Words that once felt distant now had my name attached to them. Elder abuse. A father, humiliated and beaten, betrayed by his son. But this time, I was not powerless. This time, the system was on my side. As I signed the papers, my hand shook, but my heart did not. I told myself, this is the first step, the beginning of his fall. He thought he had locked me away forever, but I had unlocked something stronger. My own voice, my courage, my will to see him punished. Walking out of that police station, the air felt different. It felt cleaner, sharper. For the first time in years, I was not walking back into silence. I was walking into war. Not with fists, not with anger, but with truth and law as my weapons. My son believed power came from shoving me into a trunk, but he was wrong. Power came from speaking. Power came from standing. Power came from justice. And justice had finally heard my voice. Filing the police report was only the first strike. My son thought the abuse alone would not be enough to destroy him. He thought even if the law questioned him, he could twist the story, deny the truth, and walk free with his pride still intact. But he had forgotten something. For years, I had been the one cleaning up his messes. For years, I had been the one holding the evidence of his sins. Every debt, every fraud, every lie he had buried. I had kept the papers. I had kept the truth locked away in my drawer, hoping he would change. But after that night in the trunk, I knew hope was dead. It was time to use what I had saved, not to protect him, but to destroy him. When I returned home after filing the case, I went straight to my room. My body still ached, but my hands moved steady as I pulled out the old wooden drawer at the bottom of my desk. Inside, wrapped in envelopes and folders yellow with age, were the secrets my son thought were gone. Bank slips of money he had taken. Letters from loan officers demanding repayment. Receipts of debts he never cleared. Documents with my signature because I had stepped in to save him. Even papers showing fraud in his small business. Contracts broken, money stolen. I had hidden them out of love. Now, I gathered them out of justice. I placed the stack of files on the table. My eyes burned as I looked at them. Every page was a memory. Every receipt was a night I had gone hungry to pay his bills. Every letter was a reminder of the son I had shielded from ruin. My heart clenched, but my resolve did not. These papers would be his undoing. These papers would show the world who he truly was. The next day, I returned to the police station. When the officer asked if I had anything else to add, I placed the stack of evidence in front of him. His eyebrows rose as he flipped through the papers. He saw the unpaid loans, the forged signatures, the stolen amounts. He looked up at me and said, "Sir, this is serious. This is more than abuse. This is fraud." I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said, "and it is all his." From that moment, the case grew bigger. It was no longer just about an old man locked in a trunk. It was about a man who had spent years lying, stealing, and living on a foundation of rot. The investigators dug deeper. They contacted the banks, the creditors, the people he had cheated. One by one, the pieces fell into place. His secrets, which he thought were safe in shadows, now burned in the light. At night, I imagined his face when he realized what was happening. I imagined him sitting in his room, hearing the knock on the door, being handed papers that listed his fraud, his debts, his crimes. I imagined his arrogance melting into fear, his smirk collapsing into silence. The same silence he once forced on me. That thought gave me strength. The news spread quietly at first, then loudly. Neighbors whispered. Relatives asked questions. "Did you hear? The son, the one who called his father baggage. The police are looking into him." The shame that he had thrown at me now clung to him. People no longer looked at me with pity. They looked at me with respect. They saw I was not weak. They saw I was a father who finally stood. I knew what I had done. I had pulled the last shield away from him. I had turned the secrets he thought I would bury into weapons he could not escape. He had mocked me, shoved me, locked me in a trunk. But now he was the one trapped in his own lies, trapped in the truth he could not run from. Exposing the dirt was not easy. Each paper I gave the investigators was like ripping open an old wound. But I did it with steady hands, because I knew this was justice. He thought humiliation made him strong, but it only made me sharper. He thought silence meant weakness. But my silence had ended. And with each page, each file, each exposed lie, I was building his downfall brick by brick. By the time I was done, the investigators no longer saw me as just a victim of abuse. They saw me as a witness. They saw me as the man who held the key to years of hidden crime. My son thought locking me in the trunk would bury me. Instead, it had set me free. and it had chained him to the truth he could no longer hide. The fallout came faster than my son expected. He thought he had time, thought he could twist the story, thought he could silence me like he always had. But once the police had my statement and the evidence in their hands, the clock began ticking on his arrogance. For the first time in his life, he was no longer in control. The man who laughed while shoving his father into a trunk was about to be dragged into the open, not as a son, not as a husband, not as a respected man in the neighborhood, but as a criminal. It began with the first visit from the police. Neighbors crowded near their windows, pretending not to look, but I knew they were watching. They saw the squad car pull up in front of his house. They saw 2 officers walk to the door. They saw the knock, firm and loud. My son, who once strutted down that street with his chin high, now opened the door in shock. He thought it was a mistake, maybe a routine question. But when the officers handed him papers and asked him to come with them, his smirk began to fade. His wife stood behind him, frozen, her arms crossed tight. The news spread like fire. By evening, whispers filled every corner. "Did you hear?" The police came for him. The old man filed charges. There are fraud papers, loans, debts. The same relatives who once laughed at his jokes now shook their heads in disgust. The same neighbors who once smiled at his arrogance now muttered about his disgrace. The man who mocked his father in public now carried shame heavier than stone. The second blow came when investigators raided his office. Files were pulled, computers taken, workers questioned. For years, he thought his lies were safe, his fraud invisible. But with every drawer they opened, with every email they printed, his mask crumbled. He was no longer the man who called me baggage. He was baggage himself, carried away by the weight of his own sins. At home, his wife's smirk disappeared. She had once laughed at me, pointing her eyes like knives when I shook at the dinner table. But now her eyes turned cold toward him. I heard her voice through the thin walls one night shouting, "You've destroyed us. You couldn't even control your own father, and now look what you've done." The same woman who once enjoyed my humiliation now poured her anger onto him. His pride collapsed within his own house. And then came the arrest. I stood outside that morning, leaning on my cane, as the squad car returned. This time, it was not for questions. It was for chains. The officers knocked again, harder this time. Neighbors gathered openly now, no longer hiding behind curtains. When they pulled him out in handcuffs, I saw it. The fear in his eyes. The man who once shoved me into a trunk like luggage now stumbled on the steps, his hands bound, his dignity gone. He looked around, searching for sympathy, but there was none. The people who once admired him now looked at him like dirt. His wife stood at the door, silent, her face pale. She did not plead. She did not cry. She only turned her back and walked inside. Even she had abandoned him. The officers placed him in the car, and the sound of the door slamming shut was sweeter to me than any laughter he had ever thrown in my face. That sound was justice. That sound was my answer to the trunk. The fallout did not stop there. His name appeared in the local paper. The words were sharp. Man arrested for elder abuse and fraud. His face, once full of pride, was now printed under headlines of shame. Relatives called each other, spreading the news. Some cursed his actions. Some pitied me. None defended him. His reputation, built on lies and arrogance, was ashes. That night, my phone lit up. Not with insults, not with orders, with missed calls, dozens of them. 42, then more. Each one his desperate attempt to reach me. Each one his cry for mercy. But I did not answer. I sat in my chair, silent, staring at the phone as it rang. The same silence he once forced on me at the dinner table, I now gave back to him. Silence is heavier than words. Silence is sharper than knives. My silence was his punishment. The fallout was complete. His friends avoided him. His wife despised him. His neighbors mocked him. His relatives rejected him. He was alone, disgraced, stripped of everything he thought untouchable. And me? I was no longer the beggar, no longer the baggage, no longer the old man to be mocked. I was the father who rose. I was the man who spoke. I was the one who ended his reign of cruelty.